see us over there. So the program that VicRoads funds is called Starting Out Safely, and as I said, this is one of the components of it. So children as passengers, there's some pretty horrific statistics out there about what happens to children as passengers, and on average there are 30 0 to 18-year-old children killed, and 622 are seriously injured on Victorian roads every year. Now that's a statistic that we can do something about. And we can do something about that by having children, an Australian standard approved child restraint, the proper restraint for the child that's fitted correctly. And statistics show that if we have a child that's in an Australian child restraint that is fitted properly, that they have a 30 to 96% lower chance of being injured in a crash. And you'll see that there's a big difference between the 30% to the 96%. The 96% is about the newest child restraints. So the newest child restraints that we've got now are much safer than the child restraints that were built 10 years ago. So that's one of the things that you should be thinking about when you're thinking about how safe is a child restraint. That statistic that shows the difference between an older child restraint, which means that a child is 30% lower risk, compared to a newer child restraint, which may make them 96% safer. So the road rules in Victoria are that everybody is required to wear some sort of restraint. For us, it's a seatbelt. And for children, the law states in Victoria that they must be in a child restraint. There are a number of different child restraints. So there's a rearward-facing child restraint, and they're the ones where the child is lying down and facing the back of the car. Then there's a forward-facing child restraint, which is a child sitting up in a restraint with an inbuilt harness, the one that has the clip in the middle. Then there is a booster seat, and that's a seat that lifts a child up, but that uses an adult seat belt. Yeah? And finally, there's the adult seat belt. So that's the different types of restraints that there are out there. So children under 6 months must, by law, be rearward facing. They must face the back of the car. Yeah? And a lot of people don't know why that is. Okay? So what happens in a crash? And if you're hit in the back or you have a front end crash, you know that what happens to adults is that your head goes forward. Yeah, like that. Babies' heads are big compared to the rest of their body. So they've got a big head, and not terribly well developed muscles in their neck, etc. So in a crash, if you suddenly hit something, that head whiplashes forward. Whereas if they're lying down and facing the back and they're in a crash, that head goes into the child restraint. Yeah? And the impact is absorbed in that child restraint and there's not that neck damage. So that's why it's important not to move your child into a sitting position too early. Yeah? So you should keep your child rearward facing, so facing the back of the car, for as long as you can, as long as they fit within the child restraint. And you'll see in the child restraints that there's shoulder markers that'll say once the child's shoulders are above that mark, they're too big for that restraint. Yeah? So try to keep them rearward facing for as long as you can. There are now products on the market that keep children rearward facing for 2 years or longer. However, there are some children that are not going to let you keep them rearward facing for 2 years or longer. They're going to drive you crazy. They're going to scream and all that sort of stuff. They want to see the world. As long as they can sit up independently, have strong neck muscles and good control, you can put them in that forward-facing position. Yeah. So don't move them to 6 months just because the law says you can. Right? And so some of the stuff that I'll be talking about today, we'll be saying there's the law, but we can do so much better than the law, and that's one of the instances. The law says 6 months, don't do it just at 6 months because the law says you can. So the law says from 6 months to 4 years, they can either be rearward facing or forward facing in a child restraint. So up to the age of 4, the law says they have to be in a seat that has one of those clips, that has the full harness with the clip. Not one of those H harnesses, but a harness that goes over the shoulders and has the buckle in the middle. Again, you might have a child restraint for a child that's up to the age of 4, and your child might be older than 4, but still fits within that child restraint. keep them in that child restraint. The safest child restraints are the ones that have that harness, that have that system. So keep them in those for as long as they fit into that system. However, there are now also new child restraints that have those inbuilt harnesses, and we've got one over there, that fit a child up to the age of 8. All right? So there are now child restraints that will have a child from 6 months, even though I wouldn't put them forward facing until after 6 months, but from 6 months up to about 8 years, yeah, with that inbuilt harness. But the law says up to the age of 4, they have to be in one of those ones with an inbuilt harness. And children 4 years to under 7 years either have to be in a child restraint or a booster seat with an adult seat belt. Yeah. So as I said before though, I would prefer my child to be in one with an inbuilt harness rather than the adult lap/seat belt. So here's another instance where I'm going to be saying that the law says 7 and it makes no sense. You can have a 7-year-old that's that tall, you can have a 7-year-old that's that tall. It doesn't make sense to say that there's an arbitrary age that a child doesn't need to be in a child restraint or a booster seat. So children aged 7 to under 16 must be restrained either in a suitable booster seat or have an adult lap/seat belt. Right? So a child that is taken, so the law says 7, but a child who is too short that's sitting in a car with an adult lap/seat belt, their legs can't fold over the front of the seat properly because they're too short. So what they have to do is that they have to slouch down. So the seat belt ends up around their neck and across their stomach. So in a crash, that's where the injury is going, where the impact is going to be absorbed. Yeah. So what a booster seat does with an adult seat belt is it lifts them up. So the adult lap/seat belt is going in the right position. So when you wear a seat belt, it goes across your shoulder, your sternum, and down low over your hips. And the reason that it does that is that the strong bones of your body are absorbing the impact of a crash. And that's what child restraints do. They position the belts in a place so that the bones of the body are absorbing the impact. And for those of you that are pregnant, you know that you need to keep that seatbelt low down so that if you are in any kind of a crash, that those bones are absorbing that impact, yeah? So the same thing applies to children. A booster seat will lift them up, or if they're in a child restraint that has the proper harness, that in a crash is absorbing the impact from that crash onto their bones. So what happens with a child that's too short for an adult seatbelt and it's rubbing into their neck? What they do is that they put their arm over the seatbelt, and then what do they have? They've got 2 belts going across their stomach. So in a crash, what happens is that the top of their body goes forward and all the impact is being absorbed internally here. And so there can be some pretty horrific injuries from that. So don't take children out of child seats too early. Keep them in there until they're about 145 centimetres, which is about that tall. Yep. Knowing when a child can come out of a child restraint, another way is 145 centimetres or a 5-step test, which is, can they sit with their back all the way against the back of the seat? Do their legs go across the front of the seat? Does the seatbelt go in the correct path, the shoulder, the sternum and the hips? And can they sit like that for the whole time? If the answer is yes, then they're right for an adult seatbelt. A child under the age of 7 is not allowed to sit in the front seat of a car. But again, don't put them in the front seat of a car in an adult seatbelt if it's not in the right place. Yeah? So if you've got a short 10-year-old, don't let them sit in the front seat of a car if the seatbelt's not going in the right place. The only time a child under the age of 7 can sit in the front seat of a car is if the back seat's full of other children that are younger than them, and that they're in a booster seat in the front that doesn't have the tether strap. All child restraints in Australia must meet Australian standards. We have some of the highest testing standards in the world, and so any child restraint that you buy must have that sticker on it. Okay? There's a new system in place called Isofix, and in Australia we have Isofix compatible child restraints. You cannot use a child restraint from overseas in Australia. So It has to have that kind of sticker on it for it to be allowed legally to be used in Australia. So the other thing is about using your child restraints correctly. So you've gone and bought a child restraint and you've got a choice for your first child restraint. You can either buy a capsule or you can buy a rearward forward facing convertible child restraint. So one that starts off lying down and then that later on goes into the sitting position. Yeah? So your choice is between those two to start off with, but you have to use them correctly every time. And children in a misused restraint are 5 times more likely to be injured than those who are in a proper restraint that's properly fitted. Make sure you use a tether strap, always. Always make sure that you've connected your child restraint to the anchorage point. All right? And if you're not sure where that anchorage point is, read your car manual. All right? Don't, especially in station wagons, there's so many different places and luggage clips and all that sort of stuff that you've got. Make sure that you're using the right place to clip in your child restraint. So that's an example of what could happen where there's a luggage clip that's close to an anchorage point. Use the correct one. Some of you might have parents or who might have these. We don't recommend that they're used. They no longer meet Australian standards. It's still legal to use them, but don't use them. Accessories. When they test child restraints for Australian standards, they take them out of the box, they read the manufacturer's instructions, they fit them onto the sled, and then they do the crash testing. Yep. They don't test them with all the extra bits and pieces that you may be able to buy. All right? So be careful about buying all those extra bits and pieces because you may be changing, how that child restraint works. Yeah? So know that we've got an incredibly stringent testing regime in Australia. Be confident that what you're buying when it has an Australian standard sticker is safe. Don't go mucking around with it too much. Yeah? H harnesses. When you go into a booster seat, something else you might think that having one of those H harnesses, which has got the H across here, is safer than using a adult lap sash seatbelt. It's not. It is always safer to use an adult lap sash seatbelt than it is to use one of those H harnesses. Down the track, when it comes to making choices about child restraints, you can go to this website which has a star rating. It's like how safe is your car for child restraints. However, because the standards have only recently changed, there's a bit of a gap from the time that the new restraints are on the market and they're tested for the safety rating. Yeah? They definitely meet Australian standards, but we don't necessarily yet have star ratings for the newest restraints. But within 6 months or so, that'll all be fixed. So down the track, when you're looking maybe for your next restraint, you can look on that website to find out the safety rating. Because some child restraints just make it when it comes to Australian standards, and some do so much better. So that website is a website that has lots of information in relation to child restraints. And the only other thing I was going to say to you, when you do buy your child restraint, take it out of the box, read the manual from start to finish. Don't miss any of the words, all right? Make yourself familiar with what that book says. Make yourself familiar with all the parts of that child restraint. Put it into the car yourself. Give it a go. And men, do follow instructions. Do read the manual. Put it into your car. Give it a go, all right? If you're not confident that you've done the right thing, if you're not confident that you've done it properly, go and see a fitter. But when you see a fitter, don't give him a box and go off and have a cup of coffee. Watch what he does, or her. Watch them and see what they do. Get them to explain what they're doing. Have a go yourself with them watching you, because the obligation for that child restraint to be fitted properly is yours. And you never know when you're going to have to take that child restraint out. If your baby's sick and you have to and vomits on the child restraint, or it's dirty, or you need to you need to pick up someone from the airport, whatever. You may need to move that child restraint. You need to know how to fit it. Right? So familiarise yourself with it first. Secondly, have a go putting it in yourself. Go to a fitter if you need to, but make sure when you leave that fitter, you know how to do it yourself. And I think, is that it for my time? I've got 2 minutes. So if anyone's got any other questions for anything that I haven't covered, we'll get a microphone to you.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned Isofix before, and I do have an Isofix compatible car, but can you explain to me what the difference is?
Okay, so so those of you that have got newer cars and imported cars, you'll see that there's sometimes like a button on your back seat, some buttons on your back seat, or that there's a mark that says Isofix, right? So in Australia we don't use Isofix seats, we use Isofix compatible seats, which is good that you said that. So what we use are seats that use that Isofix component. So what that is like a metal bar that's running through the back seat of the car. So instead of using the adult lap seat belt, you clip the seat into those points, yeah? And there's good and bad about it, You can still misuse those seats. When you clip it in, if you've got the flexible connectors, you do need to make sure that they're tightened every time and that they're connected properly. They are no more or less safe than using a normal belt. And in Australia, all of those child restraints have to be able to be used either as Isofix or non-Isofix. So, and there are some child restraints that will automatically come with Isofix, and you can choose to use them one way or the other. Is there any other questions?
Anything else? If there is and you'd like to talk to Zora personally, she'll just be so far away over at this stand. And if I can reflect on the experience to learn how to take your car seat out because of the vomits that these babies do, I speak from experience.